So Blender version 4.3 was just released, and in the update they've done a lot of changes to these sculpting brushes. So they've updated some of the sculpting brushes, they've added some new sculpting brushes, and they've changed the thumbnails. And the sculpting brushes are now assets in Blender, so you can actually create and customize your own sculpting brushes and add them as assets in your Blender files. So in this video, I'll be going over some of the brushes, and I'll be going over like the different libraries for the brush assets. Now after this video, I'm going to be creating a separate video which is more in depth on how to create your own sculpting brushes, and in that video we'll be creating these 5 different custom sculpting brushes. So just stay tuned for that. You can also find it with the link in the description when it's released, or you can also subscribe and then you'll be updated when that video is released. And for demonstration in this video, I'm going to be using these human base meshes. This is from Blender's website. I'll have a link in the description if you want to download it, and I'll be using one of the head models to demo the brushes in this video. So if you open up Blender version 4.3 and jump into sculpt mode, you can see the brushes are going to be down here at the very bottom, and that's why my face is over here. Usually I have my face on the other side during my video tutorials. And unfortunately, I don't think you're able to move the brushes over to this side. So in the old version of Blender, the brushes were over on this side, and if you hit the T key, that's going to bring up the tools panel. And so there are some tools here, but the brushes are now on the bottom. Now I hope that in a later update of Blender, they'll add a feature where you can add the brushes back over to this side, because I do like them better over on this side, but for now they're down here on the bottom. Now if you really don't like this panel down here and you don't want to see this panel, what you can do is just click and drag here on the top of the panel and drag it down to hide it. You can also click on this arrow to bring it back, but there are actually some other ways to get to the brushes. So you can press the Shift spacebar. Shift spacebar is a shortcut key to getting to all the brushes. What you can also do is click up here and you can see it's going to show you some different brushes, and then as well as that, over here on this side panel, you can also click right here and go to the different brushes. So there's really a lot of different ways to get to the brushes if you don't like using the brushes there on the very bottom of Blender. Now, as I mentioned, the new brushes are actually assets in Blender. And so this brush panel acts very similar to the asset library in Blender. So if I click right here, I can drag it up to make it a bit bigger so I can see all the brushes. And also if I click on this button here, I can drag up the size to make the thumbnails bigger. So you can see this is very similar to the asset browser in Blender. I can also turn on the names here, and I like turning on names, especially because we have so many new brushes. I don't really remember what all the brushes do, so I'm going to keep on the names. Now over here on the left side, you can see similarly to the asset browser in Blender, there's going to be different categories that you can change. So there's like the painting brushes. This is for using the vertex painting, which I actually have a separate tutorial on that. If you want to check that out, link is in the description. And you can use simple colors using the vertex painting to paint colors onto your 3D sculpts. Now you can also click on the 3 little lines here, and you can see it's going to actually show you your different asset libraries. So for example, if I just like click on the asset libraries and change this to like my low poly nature, nothing's going to show up, and that's because these are not brushes, they're 3D models. So just make sure you change this back over to all libraries, and it's just going to show you the brushes in this window. Now what I can also do is I can click on these arrows here to open these up, and I can turn on all of the different brushes just so I can see all of them. So now you can see there's going to be different categories. So there's all, of course, to see all of them. Then there's also just the general one, and the general one is going to have pretty much all the brushes and then also some different tools. Then there's add and subtract, and add and subtract are going to be the main brushes that you'll probably be using. So probably when I'm sculpting, I'm just going to have my default startup file like this set to add and subtract, because these really are the main brushes that you're probably going to use most of the time because they add clay and remove clay. Then there's also these new brushes called contrast. So there's some different ones which I'll be going over. Then there's transform ones, and these ones are very similar to the grab brush. You can see here's the grab brush that we've had in Blender before, but there's a bunch of different new ones, and they're similar to the grab brush, but they all have their own specific use. Then there's utilities, and that is basically just the tools. You can also get to the tools over here on this panel. Then there's the painting, which allows you to do the vertex painting. And then there's also the simulation tab, which is all of the cloth brushes. So we had an old cloth brush in the older version of Blender, but they've now added a bunch more, just like they've added a bunch more to these other brushes. So I'm just going to start by going to the add and subtract. So first we have the blob brush, and this is really exactly the same as the old blob brush in Blender, so it just adds a blob there. Then there's the clay brush, and this one kind of just adds a small layer of clay. So I'm just going to turn up the strength a bit so you can kind of see it better. You can see now we're kind of adding like layers of clay. Then we have the good old classic clay strips brush. This is really my favorite brush. I pretty much use this all the time when I'm sculpting, and just like the old version of Blender, if you hold down the shift key, that is going to go to the smooth brush, and so you can smooth it out. Then we have a new one here called this clay thumb, and this one has a very realistic feel to it, because if you were to push your thumb into actual clay, the clay would need to go somewhere. So normally when you're just using like the clay strips brush, you can like push into the clay and the clay really isn't going anywhere. But in the real life, in the real world, if you were sculpting with clay, the actual clay has to go somewhere. So you can see as I push it up, it's kind of making this little spot here on the end where the clay kind of builds up. So that's pretty cool. I don't think I'd use it too often just because it does add that little bit there at the end, which I don't really like. But if you're trying to go for a super realistic like clay-like result and make it look like it's made out of real clay, that could be very useful. The next one is the crease polish, and this one is very similar to the crease brush. You can kind of see I can crease this. I believe it's exactly the same as the crease brush, but then there's another one called crease sharp. And so this one pretty much does the same thing, but it's a lot sharper. So you can see if I just kind of go along here, you can see it's really sharp. Let me make my brush bigger, kind of show you. So it's really sharp and pointy. And also if I hold down the control key, that is going to push it out instead of bringing it back in. Then there's the good old draw brush. So this is again a brush that we've had in Blender, an old brush. This was like the default brush in Blender that we've had for a really long time. It basically just makes a circular blob on the sculpt. Then we have this draw sharp one, and this one is similar to the crease sharp, so it almost looks like it's adding a crease, and I can hold down the control key and also pop that out. Then there's the inflate and deflate, and this one again we've had in other versions of Blender, so let's just like inflate that neck muscle like that. And then there's another one here called the layer brush, so let's add the layer brush, and this one I need to turn the strength down because it's way too strong. You can see it's like pushing it out really strongly. So this one is quite strong, there's quite a strong effect, so you do need to be careful with it, but I can just push out layers of clay. Let's go to the next one here, which is contrast, and so these are some really cool new brushes. So there's a fill and deepen one. So for this one, it's good for if you have like crevices or creases. So you can see there's kind of like a hole here. So if I just go along here, you can see it's going to fill in where that crevice was. But if I try to like sculpt over here, it's not really adding anything here. It's only adding it in where the crease is or where the hole is. Same thing for right here. If I just have this mouth, try to kind of paint this in, right here where the top of the mouth is, I can't really sculpt much, but then right here where the crease is, I can sculpt. So it's really good for filling holes. Then we also have the flatten one. So I'll make my brush a bit bigger. Let's just go like right here. And let's say I want to kind of flatten some of these planes. So I can go along here, kind of flatten that out. And you can see as well as it flattening it, it's kind of popping out the mesh. But then if I hold down the control key, it's going to add more contrast. So I'm just sculpting a lot with my drawing tablet, going back and forth there with the pen. And you can see it's adding lots of contrast. So because there was a small part which was coming out and then going back in, it's going to add contrast there. Hold down the control key and it's going to add contrast. So the parts which are already popping out will pop out more, and the parts which are going back in will go in more. Now there's also this plateau brush, and I don't really know where this would be useful. I'm sure some sculptors would find this useful because the Blender developers added this brush, but you can see when I start to sculpt, it's really thin and it's not very deep. And then as I go farther and farther, it comes out more. So it starts out really shallow and then it gets higher and higher. Then we have the scrapes multiplane here. So for this one, again, I'm going to make my brush a bit bigger. And for this one, I can kind of go back here, go back along here, and it works for kind of parts like this where it's popping out more, and I can basically scrape away clay. So it's almost like if you were using like a thin piece of metal and you were just like scraping away clay in the real world, and I can just kind of scrape that away. And I can just make like the different planes of the head. And then there's also the scrapes fill brush, which I actually think I like this one a little bit better for the scraping. So if I kind of scrape this away, you can see I can just really flatten this. I think this one works a bit better for kind of flattening out places on the head. And then if I hold down the control key while I'm sculpting with this, it's going to kind of fill in areas. Then we have the good old smooth brush. So this one, if you hold down the shift key, it's automatically going to go to the smooth brush. But of course, the smooth brush is just going to smooth out the mesh. And then there's also this trim brush here. So if I just go along like the character's jaw, you can see I can kind of make these flat areas. I don't really know why I'd use this. I don't find it super useful. And then let's go to the transform ones. So for the transform ones, like the normal one, which you're probably familiar with, is the grab brush. So the grab brush was already in Blender. So this brush is super useful for just like moving around objects and kind of changing the proportions and things. But there's other ones which are similar. So for example, there's like the snake hook one, and the snake hook one you're probably familiar with because the snake hook brush was already in Blender, so I can like pull out mesh. Now there's also this grab 2D, which is very similar to the grab brush, but with the grab 2D, it's gonna grab the mesh which is behind it. So for example, if I make this brush bigger and I start to pull this out with the grab 2D, now when I move over here, you can see it also pulled the back of the head. You can see it's pulling along all the mesh behind it. Whereas if I were to just use the grab brush, let's go to the back here, and if I were to just pull this with the grab brush, it's only going to pull this part but not the back. And then there's also this nudge brush, and there was also a nudge brush in the old version of Blender before Blender 4.3. So this one I can just use to kind of add little tiny adjustments, just kind of nudging or pushing around the clay. And then there's also the pinch and magnify. So if I just go along here, it's gonna like pinch it in and kind of shrink it. Or if I hold down the control key, it's gonna do the opposite. So it's gonna kind of enlarge it. So it is kind of similar to the inflate brush. Then there's the pose brush. Again, this one was in the other version of Blender. So if I make my brush really big with the pose brush, you can see it's gonna give us these little lines. So I can use this if I just want to like pose a base mesh before I did some sculpting. And if I jump over here to the utility sections, there's a few different tools, and many of these were already in Blender. Like for example, there's the mask brush. So I could mask out an area using the mask brush. Then I could go back to general, maybe just use the clay strips brush. And if I start to go along here, you can see wherever the mask is, it's not going to be affected. And then I could smooth this out. And then if I press Alt M is going to get rid of the mask. And also one other thing you can do is you can press Control I, and Control I is going to invert the mask. So if I press Control I, now everything else is masked out, so I can just sculpt where the eyes are. Then we also have the paint section. So for this one, we have all of these different new paint brushes, which we can use when we're using the vertex painting. And again, I have a video on how to use the vertex painting to paint your sculpts in the sculpt mode. If you want to check that out, link is in the description. Let's just jump over to the hard paint for now. And I'll just make like a color here. Let's maybe just go with like a red color. So these are pretty self-explanatory. So we have this nice hard brush. Let's also use the airbrush instead, because that one's going to be a bit softer. And I need to change the color again, kind of airbrush that in. So this would be cool if you've like painted an entire character, like maybe you've painted the skin of a character, but then you just want to add like a subtle texture change. So I could make this just like a little bit more pink if I wanted to make the cheeks a little bit more pink, and then just go along there and kind of airbrush in the colors. And as you're painting, if you go right down here to the color picker on the side, you can open up the color palette, click on new, and then you can click on the plus here to add a new color. So let's just make kind of like a skin color, then click on the plus there. So now I have that color there. So now if I jump over to like paint soft, I can click on that color and it's going to choose that color in the paint. So now I can go along here and I can just paint that same color with a different brush. Then what I'm going to do is use the blends. So let's try paint blend. So I can go along here, kind of blend that. That's pretty cool. So we're now blending those two colors together. Let's also try the blend soft. That one's a lot better. I really like that one. So it's a lot softer. And I do mention this in my other video on how to paint using the vertex mode in Blender. But if you want to see the vertex painting on your object, you'll need to select the object, go to the shading, click on new to add new shader nodes, and then you're going to need to search for the attribute color. So add the color attribute, make sure that's set to color, so make sure it says color, and you can just put the color into the base color. And then you'll actually be able to see your vertex painting showing up on the model when you render it. And then finally, we have this simulation. So if I go to simulation, you can see we have a bunch of cool cloth brushes. So to demonstrate the cloth brushes, I'm just going to add a plane and I'm just going to subdivide the plane so it's really detailed. And I'm going to start by using like the grab cloth. So let's use grab cloth here. And this is really fun to play around with because it feels like it's simulating in real time. So it's almost like a cloth simulation, but you can kind of pull it around and move it around in the viewport in real time. So that's really cool. And I'm also going to use the drag cloth one. So this one, I can just kind of drag around the cloth. So if I just want to like pull along the cloth and just kind of make it look like we have maybe like a cloth napkin or something on a table, I can just kind of pull this around. Let's also use the inflate cloth. So then I'm going to go along here and just inflate that cloth so it looks kind of blobby. And then there's little bits which are kind of hanging off of that area. Let's also use the pinch folds one. So you can see if I go along here, it's kind of adding a pinching to the cloth. So I'm sure this would be very useful if you're making like a character and maybe you're modeling like the shirt of a character. You could like sculpt in some different folds here along the character shirt. So that's an overview of the new sculpting brushes in Blender. So I hope you found the video helpful and thank you for watching. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want to learn how to create your own custom sculpting brushes, the new sculpting brushes are assets in this asset browser here. So you can create your own custom sculpting brushes. So I'll be posting a separate video on how to create your own custom sculpting brushes. And in that video, we'll be creating these 5 different custom sculpting brushes. So when that video is released, you can find it with the link in the description, or it'll be right up there on the end screen. You can also check out my Blender Sculpting for Beginners tutorial if you're completely new to sculpting and learn all the basics of sculpting. And you can also check out my sculpting tutorial playlist to watch more of my sculpting videos. But I hope you found this helpful, and thank you for watching.